1996, two librarians at the Washington State's Center for the Book, Nancy Pearl. Some of you may know of Nancy Pearl. She is the librarian that they made an action figure librarian out of, so she's fairly well known. It's true, we have them at the library, come see them. And Chris Higachi came up with an idea, and the idea was expressed with a question. What if all of Seattle read the same book? So they planned a program, and people read the book, and maybe not all the people in Seattle read the book, but thousands of people in Seattle read the same book. And then pretty soon, all over the United States, different programs popped up. One town, one book, Read It, Leverett, one book, one Chicago, and now we begin with Bergie Reads. It's an on-the-same-page project, and it's funded by the Massachusetts Board of Library Commissioners, the Williamsburg Cultural Council, the Friends of the Williamsburg Libraries, and tonight with generous help from the Haydenville Congregational Church and the Haydenville Ladies' Aid Society. On May 16th, which is the 132nd anniversary of the breaking of the reservoir, we'll gather together once again for Elizabeth Sharpe's anniversary talk called The Legacy of the Flood. And that evening, we will also present the world premiere of a new song about the flood, written by Lynn Bertrand, music by Penny Schultz, and performed by a local chorus. Now, we don't have a local chorus yet. So, we are hoping that tonight, those of you who might be interested will sign up on our sign-up sheet. And I have not heard it, but I have read the lyrics. It's absolutely lovely. It's going to be a beautiful song. So after the program tonight, enjoy the refreshments provided by the Haydenville Ladies' Aid. You can ask us about an audio recording that will soon be available of the book. Local folks have been taking turns reading chapters of the book for an audio version of it. Enjoy this evening together. And now Realm in Black will make introductions.
The Ode to Williamsburg, a poem written by John Milton Black, was written in 1926 for the 150th anniversary of the town. You may have seen it printed in the Phyllis Baker Deming History, A History of Williamsburg in Massachusetts. And about 20 years ago, Norma composed the music and rearranged the poem for lyrics to the music, and she entitled it The Ballad of Williamsburg. Performing her own work here tonight and accompanied by Wendy Emerson Sisko, Norma Monat.
We are two who have transplanted out of Williamsburg to other places. I now live in South Hadley. Wendy lives in Chesterfield, but we did live here when this was done.
And I claim Williamsburg as my own.
Yes.
Oh, Williamsburg, our Williamsburg, how dear thy name has grown. How much it means to those of us who claim you for our own. Serene hills guard the township, true north, south, east, and west. Mill River winds now sparkling as she Williamsburg, your children they may roam, but your arms are always open wide to bid them welcome home. You gave young men to die in wars to keep this country free. You cherish gifts God freely gives, the water, hills, and trees. Today, as we look backward down the aisle of hope and fear, we may trace with pride and pleasure all record of your years. Oh, Williamsburg, our Williamsburg.
That was an emotional experience for me. In 1874, at the time of the Great Flood, M Sharpe and his wife Frances lived at 9 Kingsley Avenue. He operated a tin shop with her father, and the tin shop was located on South Main Street, where the Masonic Hall is today. Along the river, the first structure as you go over the bridge and start down South Street. Their house at Kingsley Avenue was high and dry, but the tin shop was washed away. Fortunately, the Sharpe family escaped that day. Fortunate for us that their great-great-granddaughter is here with us tonight. This lady grew up in Westfield, hearing the family traditions about the Great Flood. Possibly those tales had some influence on her interest in history and drove her academic pursuits. In 1976, she took a Bachelor of Arts in American Studies at the Hobart and William Smith College in Geneva, New York. From 1977 to 1994, she had an ongoing relationship with the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian in Washington. There, she was an education specialist and became a director for public programs. In the meantime, in 1983, she earned a master's in History Museum Studies at the Cooperstown Graduate Program, New York State University. In 1995, at the University of Delaware, she successfully defended her doctoral dissertation, Capitalism and Calamity. And she modeled this on the Williamsburg disaster. She took this work to Simon & Schuster to explore the possibility of publication. Their editors advised her that if she were to rework it into a nonfiction novel, that the Free Press would be very interested. In the Shadow of the Dam was published 2 years ago, and the Consensus, the real first history of Williamsburg and Haydenville. I've been told that it's both gripping and I couldn't put it down. Last year, it earned the Certificate of Commendation from the American Association of State and Local History. Betty was engaged in the research and writing of this book for 14 years. When it was published 2 years ago, she commented to me, "Finally, it's done. My kids have never known a mother who was not writing this damn book." Now living in Amherst with her husband and 2 children, I'm honored to present Elizabeth M. Sharpe.
Thank you, Ralph, and thank you, everyone. It is indeed an honor to be here. My great-great-grandparents attended church here. That would be M Sharpe and his wife, Frances Ames. I would like to start tonight's talk, which is called On the Eve of the Disaster, by reminding you what the date is. The eve of the disaster is May 15th, 1874. Let's turn our clocks back. This morning, a small group of Mill River manufacturers set out to make their annual inspection of their upstream reservoirs. Years earlier, they had built 3 large reservoirs on the upper reaches of the Mill River by erecting long, thick earthen dams to block the river's flow and to capture the drainage from the surrounding hillsides. Each dam had an iron pipe running through it that carried the water from the reservoir into the river so it could flow down to the mills. The manufacturers could open and close the pipes or gates whenever they wanted, thus regulating the water flow into the river. Their goal was to achieve a constant flow of water to turn their wheels and turbines all day, 6 days a week. Essentially, they were trying to make something as natural as a river operate as artificially as a tap on a faucet. When the reservoirs were full, they looked like lakes. When drained, the reservoirs resembled muddy plains. The Mill River and its reservoir system was the power source for more than a dozen manufacturers in Williamsburg, Skinnerville, Haydenville, Leeds, and Florence. It was their utility. The success of their factories depended on how well they cooperated to ensure smooth operation of the river. And this is going on all over New England. This is how New England's rivers were used. On this day, the group from Florence set out for Goshen to inspect the 2 dams piggybacked on the tip of the Mill River's west branch. You know them as the Highland Lakes today. When those inspections were complete, they planned to travel over to Williamsburg to examine the reservoir dam on the east branch in the northern part of Williamsburg near the Conway Lawn. Onslow Spellman, a Williamsburg button manufacturer, was there to meet them. He had a small operation on Nash Street. But the day didn't go as planned. The group ran late in Goshen and never made it to Williamsburg. So Spellman inspected the dam by himself. He was assisted by George Cheney, the gatekeeper, whose job it was to open and close the gate and to watch the dam. Spellman had been the secretary-treasurer of the reservoir company that built the dam, and he was Cheney's immediate boss. The 2 men knew each other well. To begin their inspection, Cheney and Spellman stepped up and down the dam's steep, grass-covered banks.
I'm Onslow Spellman. I own a button mill on Nash Street. I was born in Granville and came to Williamsburg more than 30 years ago to work for Josiah Hayden at a pen factory, which is located in the brass works right outside. I depend on the Williamsburg Dam for water because my mill draws power from the river's east branch. Before the dam was built, during the summer I would have no water because it was dry that time of year, and the other mill owners down from Florence can rely on the Goshen reservoirs because they're further downstream when the river is being fed by both branches. But I can't. We, by that I mean the members of the reservoir company, began building the Williamsburg Dam in the summer of 1865, just a few months after Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, who is our current president. As you know, the reservoir company worried about the dam for years. We thought it might not be stable, but now there's no need for concern. Governor Hayden has told me last year that he said, it's all right now. A few weeks ago, I told Cheney to close the gate pipe and fill the reservoir. I'll use that water all summer long.
Cheney and Spellman walked along the dam, which was literally in Cheney's backyard. The reservoir had climbed to within a couple feet of the crest. It formed a broad lake of 100 acres. The water's massive weight, estimated at 2.5 million tons, pressed down on the dam's banks with such force that a row of leaks, which oozed more or less constantly from the base of the dam all along its length. The largest was the diameter of a man's arm. The streamlets fell into a trench, which drained their flow back to the river. On the side of the gate was a gaping, muddy depression where a chunk of soaked earth, about as much as a wagon load or two, had fallen away a year ago. Spellman hadn't asked Cheney to repair it. On the west side, near his cabin, was a fence that Cheney had repaired earlier that morning. It surrounded a patch of wet, grass-covered earth, so mushy that cattle wandering off neighboring farms mired in the mud before the reservoir company built the fence to keep them out. That patch had always been marshy. When the dam was under construction, men watered their horses there. Some men even drank from it themselves.
Now, I've seen those leaks before. So is Mr. Dimmick, who manages the silk mill and Leeds. He's a member of the building committee of the dam. The water from the leaks flow clear, which means the water isn't carrying material through the dam. So I believe the leaks are the result of the springs that are coming up from underground. They don't compromise the dam. I declare that the dam is fine for the season.
Well, I watch that dam too. I'm Elizabeth Cheney, George's wife. And I've seen the same leaks since we've been here in this little cabin for 2.5 years. The reservoir company pays my husband $200 a year to watch the dam. And he can work at the farms around here for $1.50 a day to earn a little extra. That's when I watch the dam. We have a lot of mouths to feed. We're getting by. I have a baby daughter, 4 sons, and another baby on the way. And now George's mother and father are living with us. That makes 9 people in our little tiny house. My husband and I pay attention to the water running through the dam. The stream about 2 rods east of the pipe worries us the most. It's as big as a man's arm. There's a smaller one on the west side of that pipe that's a bother too. A while back, I saw Mr. Dimmick up at the dam and I warned him about those leaks. He told me not to be a damn fool. I may not be as fancy as those mill owners' wives. I don't wear silk dresses like them. But I know what I've seen. And I've seen a lot of water coming through that dam.
The story of how such a poor dam came to be built began decades before the dam was actually constructed. It started after the American Revolution, in the early years of the new nation, when policies to develop the country's infrastructure and industry were set in motion. With a national goal of creating economic growth and no money coming from the cash-poor federal government, the states took the lead in promoting the economy. But the states didn't have any money either, and taxes were very unpopular. So the state governments granted charters and franchises to private investors who would serve public purposes by undertaking such projects as building roads, canals, railroads, banks, and even reservoir dams. The investors then owned the public improvements and assessed fees to users. Sometimes the investors were granted the right of eminent domain. In fact, by the late 1860s, you could take land for a reservoir by eminent domain. Between 1792 and 1808, the Massachusetts legislature issued 5 charters to Mill Valley businessmen for a canal, 3 turnpikes, and a bridge across the Connecticut at Northampton. These policies generated an entrepreneurial culture in which public authority merely supported the natural process of the economy, not controlled it. People could see economic activities and infrastructure building taking place without interference of government. This was all evidence of a liberal democratic society. Joel Hayden, who built the brass works and this church, grew up in this post-revolutionary era of individual enterprise and entrepreneurship. When he was born in 1798, Williamsburg was a widely scattered farming community of 600 people, clearing and tilling the wooded hills above the Mill River and ignoring the wet land around the river, which was swampy. In many places, there were no bridges, only planks across. I read one reminiscence about a young girl going to school, following her older sisters, walking on planks across the river, and the older sisters got over fine, but she somehow fell in, and the next thing she remembered was waking up at a neighbor's house. She must have knocked herself out. Joel spent the first 10 years of his life in Indian villages in western New York, where his parents were lay missionaries. By 1809, they had returned to Massachusetts, where his father purchased a rocky hillside farm in Cummington. Like other New England farmers, his father found farming a difficult way to make a living, so he was attracted by the alternative, manufacturing. And that was one of the reasons that manufacturing got started, of course, in New England.
My name is Joel Hayden. In 1812, my father built a dam on the Swift River in Cummington and opened a cotton mill. There was a steady market for American cotton then. You see, we were at war with England, and our government restricted British imports. My father's factory didn't last long, but it instilled manufacturing in my blood. In my youth, I saw many small water-powered mills like my father's. My uncles, David and Daniel Hayden, owned a cotton mill in Williamsburg on the same site where I would build the brass works. Several other uncles manufactured buttons in Connecticut. In 1822, I bought my uncle's cotton mill in Haydenville, which had been closed for a few years. I made power looms at first, and later buttons. I manufactured there for 50 years. In the 1830s, 3 of us mill owners got a charter from the state to build a reservoir in Goshen, a reservoir dam in Goshen. With a few trees upstream and the water running off the farms and pastures, our mill ponds kept getting silted, and so we needed upstream water storage. We made the Mill River Valley one of the most productive economic regions in the state.
Hayden was a man of the people, just another member of the town. This was demonstrated in a letter written in 1837 from his brother Josiah's wife, whose name was Anne, and she wrote the letter to Josiah and Joel's parents.
One of the little girls at the schoolhouse on Saturday noon caught her clothes on fire, and there being only 2 or 3 little girls present, she started to go to her father, as she said he would help her. She got 2 rods from the dry house of the button factory, when Brother Joel saw her and tore her clothes off her. He put his coat on her and brought her up to his house and laid her on the bed, where she died in 3 hours and a half later. It was little Amanda. She would have been 7 years old next July.
2 years after this incident, Hayden and 2 Leeds mill owners received a charter for their first Goshen dam. This was what's called the Lower Highland Lake today. The charter carried no associated burdens of responsibility for quality construction or design. In the rush to facilitate commercial progress through charters, the state ignored many issues of public safety and private liability. Safety was left to community standards and to the conscience of businessmen. Regulation and tort law, as we know it today, was a half-century in the future. That was essentially a progressive era, early 20th century development. Hayden built a safe reservoir dam in Goshen. He was, at his factory, an excellent mechanic and an inventor. This dam in Goshen had a stone core sandwiched between sheets of chestnut planks. If he had remained solely a mill owner, perhaps the story might have ended differently. But Hayden was more than a mill owner. He was a reformer and a religious man. He was attracted to Methodism with its emphasis on a near rather than a distant God, self-help, and denunciation of slavery. Hayden absorbed these messages and was open to the reform spirit of the age, which held that society, however flawed, could be changed for the better, and Hayden wanted to change it. Temperance was his first cause, and then abolition of slavery. He caught the first wave of abolition in the North in the 1830s and soon became the publisher of Northampton's first anti-slavery newspaper, the Hampshire Herald. A Free Soiler and then a Republican, he was elected lieutenant governor in 1862 under John Andrew and stayed in office for 3 terms until 1866. Hayden's popularity and sphere of influence spread far beyond the Mill Valley. Just how wide it was came home to me a few weeks ago when I picked up a book called The Nature of Sacrifice, a biography of Charles Russell Lowell, Jr. Now, Lowell was a young Harvard-educated man from the prominent Lowell family and an Army officer who was killed in the Civil War. The first chapter of the book describes his funeral, which was attended by the upper crust of Massachusetts society and politics, including our own Joel Hayden as lieutenant governor, leading the governor's council into the church for the funeral. Already assembled were men of letters, finance, and politics. There was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, Charles Eliot Norton, Henry Lee, John Quincy Adams Jr., members of the cotton aristocracy, the Appletons, the Boots, the Lawrences, the Lowells, who, by the way, loathed the radical Republicans like Joel Hayden, Senator Charles Sumner, the overseers of Harvard University, of which Hayden was one. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. were also there. This was Hayden's world. During the war, there was talk of Senator Sumner replacing Edwin Stanton, who was Lincoln's Secretary of War, and then Governor Andrew replacing Sumner as senator, and then Hayden replacing Andrew as governor of Massachusetts. Commentators said that Hayden was up to task, but the whole thing didn't happen. But the point is that Hayden was part of Boston politics, Washington politics, and the Civil War machine. And he knew New York City, which was where his brassworks warehouse was located. The other thing he must have known, if he knew the Lawrences, the Lowells, the Boots, and all these others, is how they constructed their water systems on the bigger water systems in the eastern part of the states, particularly the Merrimack River and the Blackstone River. Thus, in Williamsburg, Hayden was a dignitary and he was revered. He was called Governor Hayden for the rest of his life.
I spent time in Boston, Washington, and New York, but Haydenville is home, and I take great pride in it. It's where I make my money and where I want my money to stay. To make the village beautiful and to elevate the minds and spirits of those who work there. A wealthy man has certain responsibilities and privileges, and I believe I've met my obligations. I've paid for the school, this church, Catholic Church, Masonic Hall, gas lighting for the streets, and the cemetery. I like attractive architecture, which is why I spared no expense on the Brassworks office building, which also houses the Savings Bank and the Masonic Hall. I'm the leader of the Masons, the president of the bank, and I'm a member of the fire squad. Most people think the village was named for me, but it really wasn't. When my uncles began their cotton mill here in 1809, this section of town began to be called Haydenville. The name was formalized when my brother Josiah became postmaster. By the way, Josiah's house is next door to mine and looks like mine, but I have to tell you, they are very different because mine is brick and I built it new and he remodeled a wooden farmhouse like mine. Anyway, we have a strong community here, and I live right in the middle of it, which is where I like to be, in the middle of everything.
Let's meet a few of the villagers.
And I've lived in Williamsburg all my life. I keep house for my husband and baby Myra, who is 13 months old. I spend the days at home sewing Myra's baby dresses, and often Mother brings milk down from the farm and we sew on the carpet together. I know the Haydens, and I've had a call from Mrs. Joel Hayden Jr. When someone pays you a call, you sit in the parlor and talk. While it is an honor to have a call from someone like Mrs. Hayden, I admit that I prefer more informal visits from other neighborhood women when we can just sit in the kitchen and sew, keeping each other company while we watch the children. The other day, Emma Wood brought over her little baby Harold, who is Myra's age, and he crawled away, and we couldn't find him anywhere until we looked in the potato bin, and there he was. Well, spring is late this year. It's already May 15th, and the trees are just beginning to leaf out. It's because we had 4 big snowstorms the last half of April. On the last Sunday in April, we took sleighs to church. And on May 1st, the hills were covered in snow. Well, it's all melted and running into the Mill River. I don't know much about the dam, but my father-in-law, Otis Hill, now he's a careful man and he's been keeping watch on the repairs to the reservoir. He says the dam is looked upon as unsafe.
The heart of the village was the church.
My name is Reverend John Gleason. I was called to be the minister of the Williamsburg Congregational Church last year. I see Mary Hill every Sunday and often at the midweek service. When the church was first gathered in the late 1700s, it was located up on Village Hill near the farms. But when it was time to build a new one in the 1830s, they placed it in the new center of Williamsburg, which sprang up along the river near the mills. I should add, they built the new church near the Methodist church that Joel Hayden paid for. The factories are a sign of progress. They even look a little like churches with their boxy frames and bell towers. Hard work and making money are worthy enterprises. They are evidence of a healthy spirit.
My name is Mary Scully. I don't know the Reverend Gleason, but I've seen him. I'm from Ireland, and we attend the Catholic Church in Haydenville that Joel Hayden built several years ago. I came over with my mother, Mary Brennan, and she lives with us. We live in a small tenement on Mill Street, next to Eliza Downing's. She's from Ireland too. My husband, Patrick Scully, he's from Ireland. He works at Thomas Nash's farm up the South Street Hill. We are blessed with 2 children. There are lots of Irish people in this town, and most work in the mills. Lots of girls, some as young as 10, work in the cotton mill. Some of the Irish are higher up the ladder. Mr. Larkin owns a store in Haydenville, and several others farm. I hope we can do that someday.
My name is Isabelle Bryant Hayden, and I live in Skinnerville with my husband Joe, who works in the brass shop, and our little boy, whom we call Robbie or Robin. My father lives with us too, and he has brought into our house a great big St. Bernard dog named Rover. All the children in town love that dog. He is so gentle that they dress him with ribbons and hats. I met Joe just after the war, when the town gave a dinner in the church hall for the returning soldiers. I was 17 and waiting table. Joseph was 35, and he was as handsome as he was kind. I decided then and there that he would be my husband, even though he was 18 years older than me. Joseph had been a captain in the army. At the dinner, Governor Hayden, who's Joe's uncle, presented Joseph with a sword. The hilt, which had a large amethyst in it, was made of gold. He may have presented it to him because of how he had suffered. In the Battle of the Wilderness, my Joe took a rifle ball just below the right knee. The surgeon ordered an amputation, but Joe protested. He said he would risk the gangrene. Just don't cut the leg. The surgeon wouldn't hear of it until Governor Hayden interceded, and the surgeon reversed his decision. The leg still gives him trouble. 3 years after we met, we were married. The next year, we had our boy. I have a silver napkin ring engraved with the name Robin on it.
Joe was credited with the invention of the automatic sprinkler system for buildings. Not bad for a young man who had been expelled from Wilbraham Academy for tipping over the outhouse, after which his father sent him to sea for 2 years to calm him down. It's worth noting that Isabelle's granddaughter's husband, Donald McCurda, wrote an exhaustive 2-volume history of the Hayden family. A copy's in the Meekins Library, and that anecdote about the leg comes from that. By the mid-19th century, industry was changing and moving to the second phase of industrialization. Greater competition brought on by a nationwide market pushed rural entrepreneurs into a level of manufacture that was more highly capitalized and mechanized, dependent on a larger labor force, and required greater power. In the Mill Valley, the new era was ushered in by the completion of the Connecticut River Railroad in 1845, which passed through Northampton, bringing raw materials in and giving local products easy access to national markets, as well as competition from other regions. The Williamsburg branch of the railroad opened in the 1850s. Successful mill owners had to have new skills, such as the ability to negotiate advantageous deals for materials and transportation, to market their products effectively, to use new accounting methods to control costs, and to add more power. Initially, selecting a water power site and setting up the enterprise required knowledge enough, but providing adequate power for the growth of the industry was more difficult yet. With the sciences of geology, meteorology, and hydraulics and hydrology not yet advanced far enough to provide accurate information as to what to expect from their water sources, mill owners acted on instinct and practice. Most use steam power as a supplement. This is a generational change, too. Hayden is the oldest of all of these mill owners who were involved in this reservoir, and others were 12 to 25 years younger than him. The newer group was more apt to be interested in using steam power and letting the rivers go. It was during this change to the second phase of industrialization in the 1860s that the Mill River manufacturers began to talk about building another reservoir, this time on the river's east branch in the hills of northern Williamsburg.
On a July day in 1864, I staked the new dam on the East Branch. It was a begin on the west side of High Ridge and extend across the ravine to the next hill, most of it on Simeon Bartlett's farm. To mark both ends of the embankment, I drove stakes into the ground and piled rocks around them. The reservoir would cover 100 acres in a natural bowl between the hills. I returned to my duties in Boston and told Spellman to contact Albert Dwight Briggs in Springfield, an engineer of some renown, to design the dam and build the project.
The reservoir company rejected the bid from Briggs's firm. Instead, the company designed the dam for themselves and hired 2 local men to build it. The construction didn't go well from the start. There were disagreements among the mill owners about the design of the dam, and no contract was ever signed with the contractors who built it. But they managed to build it anyway. First, the contractors cleared the land and dug a trench for the base of the stone wall that was to form the core of the dam. In some places, they didn't bother to dig a trench and rested the wall on the ravine bottom. They built up the wall with stone gathered nearby and grouted it with lime and sand scooped from the banks. As they built the wall, men heaped on earth taken from the hills to form banks around the wall. They finished in January when it was really too cold for the grout to bond, but they laid it on anyway. Conflict over the contractor's work was so intense that Spelman cursed and damned them. In January 1866, with the thought they could fix it later, the Reservoir Company, with Hayden present, accepted the dam and paid the contractors. The first time the dam was filled, there was a near disaster. On a spring Sunday morning in 1866, panicked dam workers knocked on Hayden's door, who happened to be home that weekend. The reservoir was filling so rapidly with runoff from melting snow and heavy rains that the muddy banks appeared ready to topple. Hayden hurried to the reservoir and ordered workers to open the gate pipe, prop up the embankment with hemlock brush, and drive timbers into the bank to stabilize it. Later, as the water receded, the company directed more repairs. Workers widened the spillway and dumped thousands of cartloads of earth to broaden the steep bank to absorb more water pressure. Unsure about the strength of the banks, each year, Hayden instructed the gatekeeper to keep the water level low until late in the spring, when the danger of flash floods or freshets, which might topple the banks, had passed for the season. Hayden worried about the dam. He often worried alone.
1,000 times I told my sons Joel and Thomas that I'm afraid of that dam, especially the stone wall. Sometimes on rainy nights, I can't sleep thinking about it. I worry that the reservoir is too full. The banks will fail because the wall is not watertight. On those nights, I get up and drive up to the dam by myself. Sometimes I ask Thomas to go for me. It's 5 miles up into the hills and a difficult drive at night. Once I get there, I look to see that the embankments are holding back the rising reservoir. I look at the waterway to make sure it's not washing away, and I search for new leaks. The dam has always proven itself strong enough, so I have always gone home satisfied.
For the Williamsburg folk, the dam's precarious condition was an open secret. Villagers often asked Louis Bodman, a highly respected local man, if the dam was safe. Bodman was one of the original members of the Reservoir Company. He later sold his woolen mill to Henry James.
I'm Louis Plotton, and I'm 64. My family goes far back in Williamsburg. Both the Bodmans and the Haydens were among the original settlers. When the Reservoir Committee, of which I was a member, was designing the dam, we talked to several engineers, and each of them called for a core wall of some type. Like several others on the Reservoir Company, I disagreed. I didn't think it needed a wall at all. A dam should be strong enough on its own. For 8 years, people have asked me if that dam is safe. For the first 2 years or two, we knew it wasn't safe. The work as a whole was not satisfactory. In my opinion, the upper third of the wall was especially slovenly built. It was getting toward fall and getting colder as they built it, and so they hurried. Also, the engineer who was supposed to watch the contractors was sick, so there was no one to check their work. The first day the reservoir was filled, both Governor Hayden and I expected to see it go off. After all the repairs and the acceptance by the county commissioners, we had no special fear of it. Only a week ago, someone asked me about the dam's condition, and I told them it was safe.
Bodman should have learned from the engineers and not tried to second-guess their expertise. The core wall was an essential part of the dam, and in an embankment dam made of local materials, the core wall was the essentially watertight component. The banks supported the wall. The wall needed to be set into a deep trench cut into hard pan or bedrock. It needed to be constructed so that it was watertight. But there were no engineering standards for dams at the time. It was an emerging profession. Engineer Albert Dwight Briggs knew how to construct a dam.
My name is Albert Dwight Briggs. I am a former mayor of Springfield. I am also a civil engineer. Mostly I build railroad bridges, but I know about dams too. My partner, Mr. John Smith, drew up plans for the Williamsburg Dam, but the reservoir company rejected his plan, which called for a core wall of cut stone, laid dry with a covering of horizontal timbers, over which would be spiked 2-inch thick chestnut planks that had been tongue and grooved together. Too expensive, they said, and so they designed it themselves, more or less. Mr. Dimmock was the boss engineer. He's a clever man and an engineer of some experience. I never heard about the dam again until one day, about 4 years ago, I was fishing up that way, and I saw water oozing from the base all along its length, evidently caused by heavy pressure on the other side. This meant that water was finding its way beneath the wall. As the volume of water flowing through the dam increased, and as the spaces carved out by the water inside the dam widened, that wall would be worthless. I know Hayden well, and I warned him that if the dam ever broke, it would sweep everyone on its way to the Connecticut River. Hayden understood that. The reservoir should have relied on experts for such a big project. Engineers today know how to build good reservoir dams. Just look at all that work James Francis has done in the locks and canals in Lowell, and their dams in New Hampshire. Look at the Hartford Reservoir. A big reservoir dam is not a job for amateurs.
One spring day in 1873, upon inspecting the reservoir, Hayden announced that the dam was now secure. Perhaps he thought its longevity had proven its strength, or perhaps at 75 he was too old to worry about it any longer. A half year later, while on a business trip to New York, he died. Spellman became the overseer of the Williamsburg Dam by default, as near as I can tell, and not by appointment. The next spring in 1874,
Cheney, close the gate pipe, let the reservoir fill.
and so Cheney filled the reservoir. On the evening of May 15, 1874, the night before the disaster, Spellman and Cheney pronounced the dam in fine condition, probably because it appeared no worse than usual. That night, Cheney and Spellman went home. They expected the next day to be an uneventful Saturday, as did the other 5,000 people who lived and worked along the river. Children would be home from school, and farmers would drive into town.
I'm Collins Graves, and tomorrow I'll peddle milk in the village. I have a dairy farm up on South Street, and I keep extra milk and cream in an ice house at the base of Mr. Spellman's dam. I know most everyone in town, including the mill owners. Joel Hayden was married to my Aunt Lydia, and he put my father on the board of directors of the Haydenville Savings Bank. Samuel Williston married my Aunt Emily before he started the button business. They say he got the idea for button molds from my grandmother. Now, Mr. Williston's a big button manufacturer in East Hampton and the wealthiest man in western Massachusetts. That little Mill River can be pretty powerful. 10 years ago, my brother and I owned the grist mill that Mr. Adams owns now, and one time in a storm, the water surged to 16 feet higher than normal, up to the second story of the mill. It's a small river, but dangerous.
The mill owners planned to go over to their factories about 8 or 9 o'clock the next morning. Their workers would have been there by 6, including this man.
I'm Francis Broder, and I'll be at the brass shop about 6 o'clock. It will have been light for over an hour by then. I'm 20 years old. My family moved down from Canada a few years back. My father works on a farm, like I did for a time. But my brother got a job at the brass works early on, and now I'm working there too. Everyone looks down on us French, so we French stick together. It's hard on the older ones because of the language. We don't know that many people.
No one could have imagined the terrible events of the next morning, although most of them expected the worst would happen someday. Elizabeth Cheney didn't know that she'd see the dam burst. Mary Hill would never have suspected that her friend Emma would, and the baby who had crawled into the potato bin, would perish. Mary Scully and Frances Brodeur certainly didn't know that they would die sudden violent deaths, and Isabelle Hayden couldn't have suspected that she would see her father and only child swept downstream, and that her village of Skinnerville would be washed away, and that someone would find and return her boy's napkin ring weeks later. Collins Graves would never have imagined that his milk delivery would be so remarkable that he would receive a gold medal, and that his ride would be immortalized in verse, and now in song. Albert Dwight Briggs' prediction about the disaster had come true. When the dam broke, the contents of the reservoir picked up a third of the property and 88 people in Williamsburg and 51 in Leeds, and littered them most of the way to the Connecticut River. A few days after the disaster, Briggs would tell the Springfield Republican,
The more intelligent people down the valley have lived with the shadow of this disaster haunting them for years. Governor Hayden was particularly nervous about it, and any casual conversation concerning the reservoir was nearly always accompanied with some illusion of presentiment.
132 years later, we still can't believe that such otherwise smart and caring men could act with such ignorance and negligence. And we can't believe how horrible the flood and its aftermath were. A week after the disaster, Reverend Gleason preached.
The once sweet waters, which had caused the busy hum of industry to sound through the valley, has become very bitter to us. They brought death and destruction and desolation because of man's carelessness and cupidity.
Time has not washed away the bitterness. It has lingered for generations. I taste it today. I think we all do. Thank you.
Backside of going to Ashfield, and him and his wife told me that the lady that lived there was looking out her front window and could see the reservoir on May 16, 1874. She actually saw the river, the reservoir go down, and the dam burst.
Could you tell us where the physical location of the dam would have been back in 1874? About how far away would it be from here?
It would be 3 miles upstream from the village of Williamsburg, up Ashfield Road. Go straight up Ashfield Road, and where it would be today is if you took a right on Judd Lane, and you went to the end of Judd Lane, and then you walked in the woods a couple hundred yards. It was really in the middle of farmland. Simeon Bartlett's farm was up there, the Hemingway farm abutted it. So when they got the land to build a reservoir, they had to take the property of 3 different farmers, or to get easements for the rights to use 3 different parcels of land. And it was interesting that Simeon Bartlett seemed to know what kind of a thing was being built in his backyard, literally. So that when the deed was created for the easement to use his property, he had certain conditions already pegged into it. And the most important of which was that he required that a competent engineer site the dam, decide on the height of the dam, and that height could never be exceeded. For example, in Goshen, the dams that they built there, the first one was, I can't remember how high it was, but the second one they built on top of it in 1852 was higher. So that was often something they did, which was to enlarge the dams, which meant that reservoir was spreading out and taking up more territory.
There may be people who are interested in seeing the dam site. We have arranged for tours on that particular day, the 13th of May. But Eric Weber and I have led a lot of tours up there. We would be glad to take anyone and interpret to them what we know about it. However, going there is crossing private property, and the property owners is Is Chris here tonight? I haven't seen him. But the property owners are rather private about their property, and we've only gone in there after giving them notice that we're going to be there on a certain day at a certain time. And I can assure you, if you go there without giving notice, they will call the police. So if anybody wants to do this through the Historical Society or Eric and I, the Historical Commission, we would be glad to make arrangements if you contact us.
In reading about this flood, I've often wondered about the time it took for the water to get down to Haydenville, for instance. How stories of someone riding back and forth as though it took a long time. Have you calculated the miles per hour of this bundle of water and timbers and everything? I guess it was like a moving dam, so it really didn't move as fast as water would have by itself?
As near as I can guess, 9 miles an hour. And I talked to several engineers, and I talked with the dam safety folks down in Boston and talked to them about it. Yeah, given the grade and given the size of it, I think that's about as close as we could come, and they felt that that was probably about right. So that somebody on a racehorse going maybe 15 miles an hour could outpace it. And you're right, that carrying all of that stuff, it slowed itself up in certain locations. So people were able to beat it. Which sounds like a scary prospect. Yeah.
First, I love the book.
Oh, thank you.
I thought it was great. I wonder if you could touch briefly on the social compact between the townspeople and the mill owners. Why the townspeople didn't seem more angry at the mill owners who were clearly responsible for this, and then what the mill owners did to help rebuild the town.
That question about the social compact between the mill owners and the townspeople and how that played out in the aftermath, that has been a question which has bothered me for a long time, and I'm not certain I have the answer for it. But other than to say that there was this great sense of noblesse oblige between Hayden and the other mill owners and their towns. They loved their towns, the townspeople loved them. But the people also felt a certain, I mean, it was their town as well. They ran the place when the mill owners weren't necessarily on every committee and everything. So, and they felt comfortable challenging them enough to say, hey, what about that dam? Is that dam safe? But I feel like there was a line they couldn't cross, where they couldn't say, take it down, this isn't right. But after the flood, they started to cross the line. And the evidence I see for that was with the Goshen dams following the flood. Following the flood, everyone was worried about that the 2 Goshen dams might go. And if they went, there'd be another flood the size of the first one down the Mill Valley again. So what the people did was there was much more concern about it, and they demanded that the water in those reservoirs be let down. The gatekeeper up there didn't want to do it, and somebody came up from Williamsburg and threatened him with his life. You either take the water down or, you know, you're not going to be the gatekeeper anymore. So that happens. Then the year after, I'm not sure if it was that summer or the summer after, there was some talk of blowing up the dams in Goshen. Because the mill owners downstream didn't have the Williamsburg Reservoir anymore, they relied more heavily on the Goshen dams. And so they overfilled those to the point that they were putting on the flashboards, which are boards that they line up along the top of the dam to essentially a temporary way of increasing the height of the dam. And there was some talk about blowing them up, but they never did that. That talk about it comes in a letter that one of Bodman's relatives wrote to another relative, saying the people have heard about putting on the flash, no wonder there is talk about blowing them up. They didn't do it. Other farmers in New Hampshire threatened to blow up dams because of the huge reservoir dams that were used to add power to the Merrimack River. There was a lot of trouble there. But one of the things that I think held the relationship together here, especially in the aftermath, is that face-to-face contact almost every day between the mill owners and the people, where the mill owners were on the site, they were local people, their families had been here for generations, just like everybody, a lot of other people. They had a great closeness with them. And once the flood took place and the place was in ruins, the mill owners did not leave town. I mean, they were right there helping to restore order. Mr. Skinner has a depot in his home. They're on the spot trying to help people in their mill ownerly way, but they were on the spot helping people. You compare it with other disasters later on, like in the 1970s, like the big one is the Buffalo Creek mining disaster flood in West Virginia, when the owners of that dam were the Pittston Coal Company, and they were in New York, and none of them were seen again in the valley. So I think it was that reciprocal relationship that they had that helped the rebuilding of the valley. And I always found it strange that there was no outpouring, they didn't hang anyone in effigy. They didn't act out in any way. And I've always found that a little bit troubling. But I think it says something about the nature of their relationship that is certainly not like a relationship we have today.
So was there ever a threat or a mob threatening violence towards Mr. Spellman, threatening to lynch him?
There was a rumor that there was one, and then the rumor was retracted. So it never happened, but there was talk of it. Yes?
I live in a house on the river in Williamsburg, which everyone I know calls the Spellman House. It's green now. I don't know what color it was.
I don't know either.
But it's a huge house, but I'm sure it's two old houses that have been kind of joined by a modern architect, developer. But is that really the Spellman House?
Yes, it is.
Oh.
And he lived there before that house was built.
Well, we're right on the river. And I'm always told by other people, not who live in Williamsburg, but people from other places.
She's on the West Branch.
Yes, the back end of the house is
And
on
that
the
didn't
West Branch.
That's
That
right.
didn't flood.
That's right. That's where all my papers are. Upstairs, but it's right on the river, and we have never had water in our cellar. I'm happy to say. So good for Mrs. Spellman.
Yeah, good.
That's right.
He knew how to build his own house.
Oh, dear.
Yes.
Aside from was the reaction in New Hampshire and elsewhere, were there reactions elsewhere in the nation to require more stringent standards for dams? Did it have more than a regional impact?
I only looked to see if the impact was New England-wide, figuring they had the most dams. It seems that the other states in the New England cluster were more ready to create laws to require the safety of dams than Massachusetts was at that point.
Did that flood in 1874 make its way down through Northampton?
Yes.
Into the river at that point?
Yeah. It became a rallying cry about the sham with which things were built in the United States in general. That included railroad bridges, steam engines, steamboats, any other kind of public conveyance, because they weren't regulated in the way that they are today. And it was these sorts of laws by a disaster such as this one that made them happen. I sort of think about it as a big pot. And each time there's a disaster, a pebble is thrown into the pot. And once the pot gets big enough, the public can't stand it anymore, and there's the progressive era and a huge outcoming of laws which take care of these sorts of things, from pure food and drugs to railroads and everything else. And I see the Mill River flood not as a pebble in the pot, but like a big fat stone that was thrown into the pot. So yes, it took up a lot of space and it had a lot of weight, but it immediately did not change things all over the country, but it added to the number of incidents which did then cause change.
In your doing research, have you found anybody that's expressed gratitude that it happened to maybe preserve Williamsburg as a little bit of a farming community and not really an industrial center that Holyoke later came to be? Because Skinner moved down there and look how it is now. You know.
Interesting. The Mill River didn't have the power, and in fact, the era of little mills on little New England streams was beginning to come to a close. Because it was requiring so much upstream water, which even that wasn't enough, they were all supplementing the steam. The factories had to get bigger, so the bigger cities like Holyoke and Turner's Falls and that sort of thing took more and more of the industry. So it would have died down anyway. But what I found especially interesting was that in Williamsburg, after the disaster, so many local people took it upon themselves to buy those local industries and to keep them going for as long as they could. So that after about 10 years, some out-of-towners own the brass works after Joel Jr. Loses it. Then the four Hills boys buy the brass works. Their mother and grandfather were killed in the flood. I met one of the descendants at a book signing, and she said that the flood was never mentioned. So there was this kind of deep bitterness that it just didn't come out. And then at one point, the James Woolen Mill, after it had ceased being a woolen mill, was then purchased by a whole collection of Williamsburg folks, each putting in a small amount of money just to keep the industry there. So they wanted to keep the industry. And I think it went back to farming only later. Yeah. Well, thank you all very, very much.